Lena Cho wasn't thrilled about the assignment, but she didn't argue either. In her line of work, entertainment reporting for a mid-sized digital outlet, thrill wasn't exactly part of the job description. More often than not, it was press releases, rehearsed sound bites, and the occasional awkward Zoom call with someone trying way too hard to seem relatable. So when her editor slid the file across the desk with a grin and said, "You're covering Clint Eastwood's comeback junket," Lena just raised an eyebrow and muttered, "Seriously?" She'd seen the headlines, of course. The internet had been buzzing for weeks. Clint Eastwood, 95, returns to the screen in surprise lead role. Trailers showed him standing alone on a windswept bluff, hat low, voice gravelly as ever. Critics were already calling it his final ride, a farewell letter in film form, and Lena's personal favorite, a man staring down time itself. She rolled her eyes at that one. To her, it sounded like the kind of overblown praise studios paid journalists to write. Lena had built a small reputation for cutting through the fluff. Her pieces weren't mean exactly, but they had bite. She asked the questions others avoided, and she wasn't afraid to point out when something felt staged or self-important. Readers liked her honesty. Her editor liked her click rates, and lately she'd leaned into the persona, the reporter who wasn't easily impressed. So naturally, she started drafting her questions with a smirk. Does the chair from Gran Torino make a cameo? Is this your last film or just your last good film? She even typed out a joke about how, at this point, his co-stars probably had to be played by holograms or very patient statues. She laughed to herself, then deleted it. Too much. But the tone stayed. Light, teasing, a little irreverent. After all, what harm was there in poking fun at a legend who'd probably heard every joke in the book? Still, that night, as she packed her bag for the trip to Carmel, something nagged at her. It wasn't doubt, not exactly. More like a quiet echo from her childhood. She remembered sitting cross-legged on her grandfather's worn living room rug, watching Unforgiven on a grainy VHS. He never said much during the movie, but afterward he'd sigh and say, "Now that's a man who knows silence." She didn't understand it then, but she remembered the way he'd look at the screen, not with awe, but with something closer to recognition. Her grandfather had passed 5 years ago. His old film magazines were still stacked in a box in her closet. She hadn't opened them in years. The flight to Monterey was short and uneventful. Outside the rental car window, the California coast unfolded in soft blues and greens. Rolling hills, ocean mist, the kind of landscape that made you lower your voice without realizing it. The press event was being held at a quiet seaside hotel, the kind with stone pathways and no neon signs. No red carpet, no screaming fans. Just a handful of journalists from outlets big and small, all waiting in a sunlit courtyard with notepads and nervous energy. Lena checked her phone. A text from a colleague back in the city. Don't forget to ask if he brought his lawn chair. She chuckled, then tucked the phone away. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed her hair, and reminded herself, this was just another assignment. A story, a quote, a deadline. But as she stepped into the room where Eastwood was holding court, something shifted. He wasn't seated on a throne or flanked by publicists. He stood near a window, hands in his pockets, talking quietly with a young screenwriter. He looked ordinary, frail even. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his face deeply lined, but his eyes, sharp, alert, scanned the room like he was still directing a scene. When he saw the reporters enter, he gave a small nod. No grand entrance. No performance. One by one, journalists approached. Most asked the expected questions. What drew you back? Is this your final role? He answered patiently, thoughtfully, but without flourish. Then it was Lena's turn. She opened her mouth, ready to deliver her carefully crafted opener. Something breezy, maybe a little cheeky, but the words stuck in her throat. Up close, there was a stillness about him that disarmed her. Not intimidating exactly, just present, like he wasn't playing a part, even in this room full of people who wanted a story. She cleared her throat. You haven't taken a lead role in over a decade, she began, voice softer than she intended. Why now? He looked at her for a long moment. Not with impatience, not with the tired deflection she'd seen from so many celebrities. He seemed to consider the question like it mattered. Because the script felt like a conversation I never got to finish, he said finally. His voice was quieter than she expected, rough but warm. With my boy. He passed a while back. We didn't always see eye to eye, but there were things left unsaid. Lena blinked. She hadn't prepared for that. Her notebook felt heavy in her hands. She fumbled for a follow-up, something safe, but all her clever lines vanished. Instead, she just said, "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "Me too." The rest of the interview passed in a blur. She asked about the film's themes, the director, the location, but her usual sharp edge was gone. She listened more than she spoke. And when it was over, she walked away feeling strangely off balance. Like she'd stepped into a room expecting a joke and found a confession instead. Back in her hotel room that evening, she stared at her notes. They were sparse. No zingers, no viral-ready quotes, just fragments. Silence isn't empty. It's full of what we don't say. I'm not trying to prove anything. Just trying to get it right this time. She opened her laptop, fingers hovering over the keys. Her editor would want something punchy, something shareable, but every time she tried to inject her usual tone, it rang false. It felt like mocking a funeral. She thought of her grandfather again, of how he never talked much about his own regrets, but how his eyes would go distant when certain songs played on the radio. For the first time in a long time, Lena didn't know how to write the story, and that uncertainty, more than anything, told her this wasn't just another assignment. This was something else, something real. And maybe, just maybe, it deserved to be treated that way. The morning after the interview, Lena woke before sunrise. Not because of an alarm, but because her mind wouldn't settle. She lay in the dim hotel room listening to the distant crash of waves, replaying every moment from the day before. It wasn't just what Eastwood had said, it was how he'd said it. No rehearsed lines, no media-trained deflections. Just a man speaking plainly about loss, about time running out, about wanting to get something right before it was too late. She'd expected a performance. Instead, she'd gotten honesty, and it left her unsettled in a way she couldn't quite name. She got up, made coffee from the little machine on the desk, and sat by the window. Outside, the fog clung to the coastline like a memory refusing to fade. She opened her notebook again. The pages felt different now. Not just notes for a story, but something closer to a record of a real human moment. She underlined the line he'd said about silence not being empty. Then she stared at it for a long time. Back home, her usual routine would have kicked in by now. Transcribe the interview, punch up the quotes, add a few wry observations, and send it off before lunch. But here in this quiet coastal town where even the seagulls seemed to speak in hushed tones, that approach felt wrong. Like putting a cartoon caption over a photograph of someone grieving, she decided to walk. Down the narrow streets, past shuttered galleries and cafes not yet open, toward the beach. The air smelled of salt and pine. A few early risers nodded as they passed, locals, not tourists. There was a rhythm to this place, a slowness that made her aware of how fast she usually moved through life, always chasing the next headline, the next reaction, the next click. By mid-morning, she returned to the hotel. The press group was gathering again for a second round, mostly photo ops and casual chats. She wasn't required to attend, but she went anyway. Not as a reporter this time, but as someone trying to understand what had happened the day before. Eastwood was seated on a bench near the garden, sipping black coffee from a plain ceramic mug. He wore the same navy jacket, slightly rumpled, and his boots looked well worn. When he saw her, he didn't look surprised. Just gave a small nod, like they'd been in the middle of a conversation that hadn't ended. She hesitated, then sat on a nearby bench, not too close. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" "Not at all," he said. "Long night?" She smiled faintly. "More like a restless one." He chuckled softly. "Happens when you start thinking too much." They sat in silence for a while. Not the awkward kind, but the comfortable kind. The kind that only exists between people who don't feel the need to fill every second with noise. A breeze rustled the cypress trees. Somewhere a dog barked. Finally, she asked, "Was it hard, coming back after all this time?" He took a slow sip of coffee. "Hard isn't the word. Strange, maybe. You spend years stepping away, telling yourself you're done. Then something comes along that feels like it's speaking directly to you. Not to the actor, not to the director, but to the person underneath all that." She thought about that. Did you ever worry people wouldn't take it seriously? That they'd see it as just nostalgia? He looked at her then. Really looked at her. Maybe. But I stopped making movies for other people's opinions a long time ago. At my age, you either do what feels true or you don't do it at all. She nodded, but inside something shifted. It wasn't just about filmmaking. It was about living, about choosing honesty over approval. She realized how much of her own work had been shaped by what she thought would get likes. Shares, retweets, never mind whether it meant anything. Later that afternoon, during a quiet moment between interviews, one of the younger reporters, a guy with a podcast and a neon windbreaker, asked Eastwood a question that made Lena's stomach tighten. "So, with all due respect," he began, "do you think you're too old for this?" "I mean physically." The room went still. Even the publicist looked uncomfortable. Eastwood didn't flinch. He set his mug down slowly. "Age isn't about how your body moves," he said evenly. "It's about how your mind sees. And I still see clearly." The reporter stammered an apology, but Eastwood just waved it off. "Ask what you need to ask. Just don't confuse curiosity with cruelty." Lena watched the exchange with a strange mix of admiration and shame. She'd come in ready to make light of the whole thing, to treat it like a novelty act. And yet here was a man facing real vulnerability. His own mortality, his regrets. His final attempt to say something meaningful, and doing it without fanfare. That evening, instead of heading back to her room to write, she walked into town and found a small diner with checkered floors and vinyl booths. She ordered a burger and a coffee, and for the first time in months she didn't check her phone once. She just sat, watched the locals come and go, listened to snippets of conversation, about fishing, about kids, about the weather changing. Real life unfolding without a script. Back at the hotel, she opened her laptop again. This time she didn't try to be clever. She just started writing what she'd seen, what she'd felt. Not as a critic, not as a commentator, but as someone who'd witnessed something quiet and human. She described the way his hands trembled slightly when he spoke about his son, the way his voice softened on certain words, the way he didn't look at the cameras but at the people asking the questions. She wrote about the silence between sentences, about how sometimes the most powerful things aren't said loudly but whispered. When she finally saved the draft, it was past midnight. The piece wasn't funny, it wasn't snappy, but for the first time in a long time it felt like hers. Not the version of her that chased trends, but the one who used to sit on her grandfather's rug watching movies not for hot takes, but for truth. She didn't know if her editor would run it. She didn't even know if anyone would read it. But as she closed her laptop and looked out at the moonlit ocean, she felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. Not because she'd gotten a great quote or a viral moment, but because she'd shown up as herself. And maybe, just maybe, honored someone else's story in the process. Back in the city, the noise hit Lena like a wall. Car horns, sirens, the constant hum of people rushing somewhere that always seemed urgent but rarely mattered. Her apartment felt smaller than she remembered, cluttered with takeout containers and unread mail. The calm she'd felt in Carmel, the quiet certainty that had settled in her chest, began to fray the moment she stepped off the plane. She opened her laptop the next morning with coffee in hand, ready to polish the draft she'd started on the coast. But as she reread it, doubt crept in. The words felt too soft, too earnest. In a media landscape built on hot takes and snark, sincerity could look naive. She imagined her editor's face when he read lines like, "His voice carried the weight of things left unsaid," or "Sometimes silence speaks louder than any script." He'd probably say it read like a eulogy. Not a feature. She tried rewriting it. Added a light opener. At 95, Clint Eastwood isn't just back, he's back with a script that hits harder than his right hook in $1 Million Baby. It felt forced. She deleted it. Tried another. "Move over, Marvel. There's a new kind of superhero in town and he wears a cowboy hat." That one made her wince. She closed the document. For 2 days, she avoided it entirely. She scrolled through social media instead, watching the buzz around Eastwood's film grow. Memes popped up. Photoshopped images of him squinting at smartphones. Captions like, "When you realize your co-star was born in 2003. Some fans posted heartfelt tributes. Others joked about needing a walker instead of a horse. The conversation was loud, chaotic, and mostly surface level. No one seemed to be talking about what he'd actually said. About grief, about second chances, about wanting to leave something honest behind. That bothered her more than she expected. On the third night, she dug out the box from her closet, the one with her grandfather's old film magazines. Dust floated in the lamplight as she opened it. Inside were yellowed issues of Sight and Sound, American Cinematographer, even a few handwritten notes he'd scribbled in the margins. One article about the bridges of Madison County had a line underlined in pencil. Great acting isn't about saying the lines right. It's about meaning them. She sat on the floor for hours, flipping through pages, remembering how he'd talk about movies not as entertainment, but as conversations between people across time. A good film, he used to say, makes you feel less alone. She thought about Eastwood sitting on that bench, speaking about his son like it was just between them. Not for the cameras, not for legacy, just because it needed to be said. The next morning, she opened a fresh document. No jokes, no forced hooks, just the truth as she'd experienced it. She wrote about how she'd gone in expecting to be clever and walked out feeling seen. She described the way his eyes didn't dart to the nearest camera, but stayed steady on whoever was speaking. She included the story about his son, not as gossip, but as the heart of why he'd returned. And she admitted quietly that she'd been wrong to assume this was just another publicity stunt. When she finished, the piece ran just over 200 words. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't trend, but it felt real. She sent it to her editor with a short note. This is the story I heard. Hope it's the one we can tell. His reply came an hour later. Lena, this isn't you. Where's the edge? Where's the spark? Readers expect your voice, your bite. This reads like a college essay. She stared at the screen. Part of her wanted to argue. Another part, the tired, practical part, wanted to just rewrite it the way he wanted. Give them the snark. Give them the meme. Get it over with. But then she thought of the handwritten note her grandfather once left her after she'd written a school paper about High Plains Drifter. You saw what others missed, it said. Never stop looking. She took a deep breath and typed back, I think this is the right voice for this story. Can we at least try it this way? Silence for 2 hours. Then, fine, but if it flops, we go back to plan A. The article went live on a Thursday afternoon. Lena didn't promote it. Didn't post it on her socials. She just closed her laptop and went for a walk. By Friday morning, her phone was buzzing. Not with angry comments or jokes, but with messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. A film professor from college wrote, "Thank you for reminding us that journalism can still be human." A veteran she'd never met shared it in a private group with a note. This is what dignity looks like. Even the cinematographer who'd worked with Eastwood on 3 films sent a short email. You listened. That's rare. The piece didn't go viral, not in the usual sense. But it spread quietly, the way real things often do. Through emails, shared links, late-night conversations. One reader wrote, I lost my dad last year. Reading this felt like someone finally understood the silence after. Lena read every comment, every message, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't care about the numbers. She cared that someone had felt seen, just like she had. That weekend, she visited her grandfather's grave for the first time in over a year. She didn't bring flowers, just sat on the bench nearby and read her article out loud, softly like it was a letter to him. When she finished, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. She smiled. She still didn't know if she'd made the right choice professionally. But personally, she'd never been more sure. The story wasn't about Clint Eastwood, not really. It was about what happens when we stop performing and start listening, when we trade cleverness for kindness, when we honor someone's truth instead of twisting it into content, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The film opened on a Friday like most films do, but nothing about it felt typical. There were no billboards in Times Square, no late-night talk show blitz, no TikTok dance challenge tied to the soundtrack. Just a quiet rollout in select theaters and a modest streaming release. Yet by Sunday, something unusual was happening. People weren't just watching it, they were talking about it. Not in hot takes or meme reels, but in hushed tones over coffee, in texts that began with, "Did you see?" Lena noticed it first in a diner near her apartment. She was eating breakfast alone, scrolling through her phone, when she overheard 2 older men at the next booth. One said, "You know, I haven't cried in a theater since my wife passed. But that scene where he's just sitting at the kitchen table, I swear it felt like he was talking to me." The other nodded slowly, stirring his coffee. He didn't say much, but he said enough. She looked down at her toast, throat tight. That kitchen table scene. She remembered Eastwood describing it during their talk. How he'd insisted on filming it in one take, no music. Just the sound of a clock ticking and a man breathing through grief. Most movies rush through the quiet parts, he told her. But that's where the truth lives. Back at her desk, her inbox kept filling, not with complaints or clickbait pitches, but with messages from readers who'd seen the film and then read her piece. A nurse wrote that she'd taken her father, a lifelong Eastwood fan who rarely spoke about his own losses, to see it. Afterward, for the first time in years, he'd talked about his brother who died in Vietnam. A high school teacher said he showed a clip to his literature class to illustrate subtext. How what's left unsaid can carry more weight than any monologue. Even her editor, usually all business and bottom lines, stopped by her cubicle one afternoon with a rare look of quiet respect. I didn't get it at first, he admitted, leaning against the doorframe. But people are connecting with this. Not just clicking, connecting. You tapped into something real. He didn't say, good job, but the way he lingered, the slight nod before walking away, said it for him. Still, Lena stayed cautious. She'd been in the game long enough to know that sincerity could be co-opted fast. She watched as other outlets scrambled to catch up. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be thoughtful about Eastwood. Think pieces popped up with headlines like, "Why Clint's final film is actually about all of us." Some were genuine. Others felt like they were wearing borrowed clothes. She refused every interview request about her article. Didn't post clips. Didn't quote tweet praise. She'd seen too many honest moments get turned into content grist, polished until they lost their soul. This one, she decided, would stay human. Then came the note. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, just her name and office address in neat, slightly shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. Thanks for listening. Most don't. That was it. No signature, but she knew. She didn't show it to anyone. Didn't scan it or frame it for Instagram. She slipped it into the back of her grandfather's old film magazine, the one with the underlined line about meaning the words, and put it back in the box. It wasn't for the world. It was for her. A quiet acknowledgement between two people who understood that some things don't need an audience to matter. A week later, she was invited to speak on a panel about ethical storytelling in digital media. The moderator, a journalism professor, had read her piece and wanted her to talk about balancing authenticity with engagement in a noisy landscape. The night before, she almost backed out. Public speaking wasn't her thing, and the thought of reducing her experience to a tidy lesson made her uneasy. But then she remembered the nurse's email, the teacher's message, the two men in the diner. This wasn't just her story, it was theirs too. On stage, under soft lights and in front of a modest crowd of students and working journalists, she didn't recite a script. She just spoke. I used to think being sharp was the same as being honest, she said, hands resting lightly on the podium. I thought if I could make people laugh or raise an eyebrow, I'd done my job. But real honesty isn't clever. It's quiet. It's showing up without an agenda. It's letting someone tell their story without twisting it to fit your angle. She paused. I went into that interview ready to write a joke. But the man in front of me wasn't performing. He was just there, and in that moment the only respectful thing to do was to be there too. Afterward, a young reporter approached her, eyes bright. How do you stay true when everything pushes you to be louder, faster, flashier? Lena smiled. You remember why you started. For me, it wasn't to chase clicks. It was because stories helped me understand people. My grandfather, strangers, even myself. When I lose sight of that, I go quiet for a while. I read old letters. I walk without my phone. I remind myself that the best stories aren't the ones that shout. They're the ones that stay with you long after they're told. Later that evening, walking home through the city's evening hum, she passed a small independent theater. On the marquee in simple white letters, Final Week, Eastwood's Last Ride. She stopped. Didn't go in, she'd already seen it twice, but just stood there for a moment watching people file in. Couples, older folks alone, a few young film students with notebooks. No one was laughing. No one was filming. They were just going to see a story. And in that ordinary moment, under the glow of a fading marquee, Lena felt something settle inside her. Not fame, not validation, just peace. She'd written the truth. Someone had heard it. And that, more than anything, was enough. Months passed and the buzz around the film faded the way all buzz does, slowly then all at once. New trailers dropped. Celebrity scandals flared. Algorithms shifted. The world moved on as it always does. But for Lena, something had changed. Not in a dramatic lightning strike kind of way, but in the quiet, steady shift of how she moved through her days. She still covered premieres and red carpets, still filed pieces on time, still met deadlines, but something in her approach had softened. She asked fewer gotcha questions and listened more between the lines. She stopped chasing the cleverest angle and started looking for the truest one. Her editor noticed. Her readers noticed. She didn't get more clicks, but the ones she got felt different, deeper, like people were staying for the story, not just the headline. One rainy Tuesday, she got an unexpected call from a small film festival in Montana. They were hosting a retrospective on actors who directed their own final roles, and they wanted her to give a short talk. Not as a critic, but as someone who'd witnessed the making of one such film. She almost said no. She wasn't an academic. She wasn't a film historian. But then she remembered the note, the kitchen table scene, the way Eastwood had looked at her like she was just another person trying to figure things out. So she said yes. The town was tiny, population under 2,000 with one main street, a diner that served pie at all hours and a theater that used to be a hardware store. The audience wasn't made up of industry insiders or influencers. It was retirees, high school kids with film club badges, a few ranchers in worn flannel. They weren't there for gossip. They were there because they loved movies that felt like real life. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't stand behind a podium. She just sat on a stool under a single spotlight and told them what it was like to sit across from a man who'd spent a lifetime playing tough guys but chose, in the end, to show his softness. I used to think strength was about never flinching, she said, voice low but clear. But watching him that day, I realized real strength is having the courage to be tender when you've spent your whole life being hard. Afterward, a woman in her 70s approached her, eyes glistening. My husband passed last year, she said softly. He never talked about his feelings. But after we saw that film, I finally understood why. Thank you for helping me see him differently. Lena didn't know what to say except, thank you for telling me that. Back in the city, she started writing differently, not just about celebrities, but about ordinary moments that carried weight. A profile on a night shift bus driver who'd memorized every passenger's name. A piece on a community garden run by teenagers who'd lost siblings to violence. She still covered Hollywood, but now she looked for the human thread beneath the glitter. Her editor, surprisingly, didn't push back. In fact, he started assigning her more long-form features. People trust you now, he said once, almost grudgingly. They believe you're not just selling something. She also stopped posting as much online. Not because she was quitting social media, but because she realized how much of her energy had gone into curating a persona, the witty reporter, the sharp observer, instead of just being herself. She kept her accounts but used them sparingly. No hot takes, no staged photos, just occasional links to stories she believed in, or quiet reflections that felt honest. One evening, while cleaning out an old drawer, she found a photo she'd forgotten about. Her and her grandfather at a drive-in theater. Her as a kid, him with a bag of popcorn balanced on his knee. She'd been wearing a too-big cowboy hat, grinning like she'd just discovered the secret of the universe. On the back, in his handwriting, you asked why he never smiles. I told you some men carry the world so others don't have to. She taped it to her wall right above her desk. A year after the film's release, she got word that Eastwood had quietly retired. No announcement. No farewell tour, just a simple statement from his team. He's hanging up his hat. The internet lit up again for a few days. Tributes, retrospectives, lists of his top 10 toughest lines. But Lena didn't write anything. She didn't need to. She'd already said what mattered. Instead, she drove out to the coast again. Not for work, just for herself. She stayed in the same hotel, walked the same paths, sat on the same bench overlooking the sea. It was colder this time, the wind sharper, but the silence was the same, deep, patient, full of things unsaid. She thought about how strange it was that one conversation could reroute a life. Not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it was real, because someone chose to be vulnerable and someone else chose to honor that. Back home, She began mentoring a young journalism student, someone who reminded her of her younger self, eager, sharp, a little too focused on sounding smart. Over coffee, the student asked, "How do you know when you're writing the right story?" Lena stirred her cup, thinking. "You'll feel it in your chest," she said finally. "Not your head. If it makes you nervous because it's too honest, that's usually a good sign. If it feels safe and slick, it's probably missing something." The student nodded, scribbling notes. Then hesitantly, "Do you ever worry you'll lose your edge?" Lena smiled. "I used to. But I realized my edge wasn't in being cutting. It was in caring enough to get it right." That night, she sat at her desk and opened a blank document. Not for work, just for herself. She started writing about her grandfather, about drive-ins and silence and cowboy hats that never fit. She didn't know if she'd ever publish it. Maybe it would stay in a folder like so many other truths that don't need an audience to matter. But she wrote it anyway, simply, honestly, without a single joke. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to be funny and just be human.